have to do something to help ensure that the young people in Washington today can live in the same communities that they grew up in. And that currently is not something that is a realistic option for them.
Well, that is Representative Jessica Bateman from the 22nd District down in Olympia, who talked to me a couple years ago about the need for her missing middle housing bill. She ended up getting it passed, but she's very concerned about how Seattle is trying to implement this law with its comprehensive plan. Well, we're also talking about expanding the Seattle preschool program, plus some more questions swirling around Seattle's municipal court. Tackling this and a whole lot more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are mine, all mine. And I am with my co-host once again, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, I always go back to these weather questions, and I have to ask it here in the Pacific Northwest. When you get that really nice string of beautiful sunny days, but then there's going to be some cold and rainy stuff right around the corner, does that take away from the rainy day? How do you look at that?
Yeah, I feel like I appreciate it. I mean, and meaning we of the Pacific Northwest,
yes,
appreciate it more than anyone in a sunny climate ever possibly could. So we know it's fleeting, and so try and take advantage as best we can.
Indeed. I just took a trip down to Los Angeles area and oh yeah, 75, sunny, whatever. And yeah, it's a different world. That's for absolutely sure. Well, thank you, David, as always, for joining me. Thanks to our patrons like Andy, just re-upped with a new credit card. Congrats on getting that new card, Andy. And thanks for staying with the show. Make sure you jump in at the $5 per month level, folks. We will answer your questions on the podcast. We do that for our patrons. Plus, you get access to patrons' first episodes, too. You can find us on Patreon at Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Email us at seattlenewsviewsandbrews@gmail.com. And I will also put out a big shout out to Converge Media. The video version of this podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, here we go with Right Here, Right Now. Well, David, these public forums started up last week on the comprehensive plan, the city's plan for zoning and housing going into the future for the next 20 years. More public input coming in this week and next, all the way through the 2nd of May. I have that date, right? Yep. That's when public comment is done. There will be an online meeting at that point. You had a very interesting article recently featuring Representative Jessica Bateman, whose bill, House Bill 1110, plays a big role in how Seattle is putting together its comp plan here. I remember talking to her about this idea back in 2022 when the measure was actually voted down, but I think the political wins, I should say, have really changed in our state about growth. And now this measure is very much front and center in Seattle. I know she had some concerns about Seattle is implementing House Bill 1110. What did she tell you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the concerns are in the details of what, because housing can be blocked in so many ways in this country. It can be, sorry, let me mute my Slack.
Oh, that'd be good. You can take it. You can take it from wherever you want to start.
Yeah, I take it from your question.
Please.
Yeah, I mean, her concerns, I think, have a lot to do with the details of Seattle's comprehensive plan, because, there are a lot of ways that housing can be blocked in this country, whether it's sort of explicitly through, zoning regulations, or kind of more implicitly through math equations that just make it more difficult to make the math work, or the puzzle, whatever metaphor you want to use. So, Seattle's comprehensive plan, it has some of the changes that Seattle's supposed to do under House Bill 1110, but it doesn't, for example, increase the amount of square footage that you'd be able to put on a lot. So right now you can basically put 3 units on any lot in the city. Seattle's comprehensive plan increases that to 4 or 6, but those 4 units or those 6 units would have to be the same total square footage as those 3.
And can I ask about that? Why is that a problem? These smaller units? Is it that developers don't want to build them? People don't want to live in them? What's the concern there?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to sort of put us to the test until, it's sort of the Nancy Pelosi infamous line about we have to pass to find out what's in it. There's the truth here, which is, there's a lot of speculation about what this would mean and how developers would react, and we don't really know the answer to that until it's passed. But the concern is, by limiting square footage, you're limiting kind of housing that you can build on that lot. So not only would it be smaller, that the units be smaller, but you just don't have as much flexibility as a developer to move units around in the way that you would want.
I see. Okay.
My hunch is if you built 4 units, you could, even if they're small, you could probably still sell them in this housing market. But I think the city itself sort of expects that not that many developers are going to take it to the 6-unit level.
I see.
That 4
which would make a real dent
spot
rather than the 4 units. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, you can get into the technical details on this stuff, but the kind of general response from Jessica Bateman was Seattle isn't going far enough to truly open the floodgates on new housing.
Got it. And in looking at that, is there any reason to think that Seattle is somehow not going to be actually following the letter of the law? Is that a concern at all, or what's the next step on that?
Yeah, because I mean, there is sort of there's a part of that bill that says they have to. I think the language is around basically you can't make it more burdensome to build or units on these single family lots than it would be to build a single family home. Her argument here is that the city is actually making it more burdensome to build these quote missing middle units than they are to build single family homes, and that would therefore make them run afoul of the law. I think we're a long way from truly determining that, and I don't know what the legal action would be.
Right.
Her case was she had a bill this last session that would give the state a little more oversight authority of local jurisdictions to make sure that they're making good on the bill to actually increase more housing. She's kind of, I think, in some ways using this as a pulpit of sorts to advocate for this bill in the next session, saying, hey, look, Seattle is a prime example for why we need this legislation. I'm sure that there's going to be a little back and forth on that.
Oh yeah. And there's always a next session. So I appreciate that insight there. So a lot still ahead with land use. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that with David in just a second here, but I did want to take a quick sidebar. Some good news from the city this week, if I may be so bold. Another announced expansion of the Seattle Preschool program. I like to focus on positive headlines too. Don't get me wrong on this. And this program, David, it's just grown into such a popular concept with Seattleites talking about another expansion of this. But what's going on with SPP?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like a huge surprise. I mean, it's voters in 2018 agreed to expand Seattle's preschool program, and this is just sort of it's continuing to expand under that vote. I talked to the director of the Department of Education and Early Learning, and his point was it didn't want to try and open all their possible units in the first year because by growing too quickly, there's risks that you could be kind of doing something wrong or improper. So they're kind of been trying to slowly and deliberately build out the program. So that's what we're seeing here is an expansion of another 16 classrooms for, I think was close to 300 additional students on bringing the total capacity up to around 2,500. There's a lot more than 2,500 kids in the city, but the state of preschool and is just so challenging for parents that I think anything makes a dent.
I think so too. And I think back to when then Councilmember Tim Burgess, who was really the architect of this project several years ago, was looking at this. And initially he called this Preschool for All. That was the name of the program as he envisioned it a while ago. It turned into the Seattle Preschool program. But I read this headline in KUOW and I couldn't help thinking, are we headed in that direction? It seems like that kind of growth is possible, potentially. It looks like the results really are there, which was great to see. It was something along the lines of the mayor was talking about this. 70% of the families currently in the program pay no tuition. So they're getting the big benefits from this. And these are families that are needing some extra help here, and they're getting at that extra boost as they get into school. I just wanted to talk about that because it looks like this program is very likely up for renewal next year for another levy. And do you see it expanding even further? What's next for SPP?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, I think you're right. It's been popular. I think the state of childcare in general or preschool is just so dire that I think it would be popular. We don't know how big they'll go. That we're going to vote on a transportation levy at some point, and that's going to be pretty big. So, the city's always cognizant of stacking too many levies on one one on top of the other. But this is, for me, kind of probably falls into the world of libraries or something that we haven't really heard anything but basically pretty good news out of the results of this levy. And I haven't heard any voices of people who are itching to roll it back or slow the expansion. So, I don't know what they'll end up doing, but I could see them, pushing ahead for a pretty big number on that. I mean, the big question for me is not really about Seattle's willingness to tax itself or the intent or people supporting it. It's really more about space and staff, because, I'm sure that the city-run programs pay their workers fairly for the industry, but it is not a great paying industry generally. And, we've heard from anyone who's trying to run a preschool or a daycare center these days, it's just hard to find people to staff them because it's hard to live in Seattle on a preschool teacher's salary. So that would be I don't know the answer to that. That would be my kind of bigger question is, could the city's appetite match the city's ability to roll, scale this program up even more?
Yeah. New dad, David Croman, breaking it down on what's going on with childcare. This is, it's a reality. I know that you're dealing with it. I did several years ago. And I just thought one last quick point on this. I just think it's so interesting. Maybe that's the wrong adjective here, but to see a program like this growing at a time when the Seattle Public School District is contracting, that it's an interesting dichotomy there. But clearly, you've got a city appetite to create this preschool program that's creating a lot of great kids going into public schools. But public schools are having some big challenges. Any thoughts on that dichotomy there?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I think that kind of goes to what happens when, there is a sort of fundamental inequity in schools in the state, which is that areas that have populations willing to tax themselves are going to have more resources than areas that aren't. See it in South Kitsap County, or county I'm in. They haven't passed a new bond in 35 years, but
Right.
Bainbridge Island or whatever does it every year. So I think there is probably a little bit of a inherent inequity in that. That said, this preschool program is serving pretty low income families, so it's not like rich kids who are benefiting from this program.
Yeah. Interesting to see how it grows. Well, thank you for that, David. An interesting program and great to see that growth happening for SPP. All right. Well, up next, more land use questions on the way. Another look at equitable development, some legislation from Tammy Morales working its way through the city council. We're going to break down some of the details next on Now Hear This. Well, the Seattle City Council has been working on a lot of meetings with its new members. Maybe you've seen some of this, in which they are learning the basics. And I mean the basics, like this is a transportation plan. This is the leadership structure of the Seattle Police Department, etc. They're working through a lot of stuff, but there is some legislation working through the mix as well. Not many pieces of it, but there is one from Councilmember Morales, who is talking about equitable development, starting a pilot program with this. And she's very passionate about affordable housing and making sure people are taken care of when it comes to equitable development, as she let the public know at a briefing last week.
Our number one goal needs to be to bring housing costs down so that people stop leaving the city. We need to make rents more affordable, and we need to make homeownership a real possibility for folks, for working class families.
So, David, Councilmember Morales is bringing this up in her Land Use Committee in Wednesday's meeting. We're recording the show just before that, but I did want to touch on this. This is starting to come together. This legislation calls for identifying what equitable development is, providing some exemption from projects that might happen here, like more height and floor area, and then actually finding groups that might build these projects and take them on. I wanted to talk about this whole concept of equitable development. Is it fully fleshed out? What are you seeing out of this ordinance?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm be honest, I don't have a great grasp on this. My colleague Heidi has been covering this a little bit, or following this a little bit more. Yeah, I think it's an effort on the part of Councilmember Morales to. We see this happening with the comprehensive plan, which is to how do you kind of upscale or upzone and increase the amount of housing stock without causing unintended consequences in neighborhoods that have had a lot of displacement. A lot of argument around that, but I think this is one of her efforts to kind of simultaneously show a more direct nexus to like anti-displacement gentrification efforts. Because even if you argue, and a lot of people do, that just the fact of increasing housing supply everywhere will combat displacement, I think there's a desire in this city, and from Morales, we've heard it from Harold too, to be a little more explicit about that. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing with this bill.
Yeah, I think so too. And I was just interested in it because, like I say, there's not that much legislation rolling through the council right now. So every time there's any sort of ordinance, I kind of want to pounce on it and
Right.
talk about it. And I understand where you're going with this one, but do you think she's going to be able to build up a consensus on this one? I know she might feel a little outnumbered because she's got one of her political opponents who's actually a council member now in Tanya Wu. I'm trying to figure out where this bill goes. Who might her allies be on the Seattle City Council right now? What's next for this bill, I suppose?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, like you said, it's almost funny that Councilmember Morales didn't need briefings on what the departments she's oversees does. So she's kind of just getting to it, not giving her colleagues a ton of time to settle in before introducing this legislation. At the end of the day, anything he does is going to have the buy-in of at least 4 members, and the rest of the council is basically pretty aligned. So there's a decent chance that she's going to need basically the rest of them, a unanimous council to support her proposals. I don't remember exactly what the nature was. I think I had heard some concerns expressed, some details of this from some of her other colleagues, but it'll be interesting to see what what comes up tomorrow.
Yeah. That's going to be an interesting discussion. There is talk about adding at least a half-time employee to try to judge some of these different projects that come in, figure out where these projects should be awarded, et cetera. And at a time when the city's really talking about making every nickel scream, as the mayor puts it, added costs are certainly something that the council will be keeping a close eye on. Not massive costs, we're talking about somewhere in the $85,000 to $90,000 range, but definitely something that'll be worth looking at as it goes through the council here. Because again, not a lot of legislation going through in the early part of the council's term here in 2024. So we'll keep an eye on that as well. I did want to talk about another issue that is rolling through the council this week. I thought it was very interesting in the Transportation Committee talking about sidewalk prioritization and how this is all going to work. Definitely heard so many candidates talk about this during the campaign. They always talk about this during every campaign, I should say, because it's very clear to see that 27% of Seattle streets are missing sidewalks, and there's probably some in your district. Every council member knows this, but the stat that jumped out at me, David, and I hate to laugh when I say this, but Department of Transportation said, okay, let's build out everywhere. Let's get all these sidewalks done. Well, guess what? It would take 400 years to complete that at the current rate of construction. What else jumped out at you about this whole thing? Because I think this is, unfortunately, something we've heard more than a few times from the DOT. They're working on some of these backlog issues right here, but it's not that easy to get all these projects off the table.
No, and I mean, sidewalk construction is less expensive than like redoing a whole road, but building a lot of wholesale new sidewalks is just it's pretty expensive. I mean, you could do a whole transportation levy just for sidewalks, and it probably still wouldn't be enough.
Right.
And so, I mean, and then there's also just like a lot of interesting questions around like whose job it is, because legally the city could bring down. I mean, it is the role of property owners to maintain their sidewalks, and so legally the city could bring down some kind of hammer against property owners and force them to improve their sidewalks. They've never used that before. They've never done that before, and they probably won't because it's a great political look. But I mean, you're talking about old trees that were planted before ADA was a consideration, and these big beautiful trees, and people of course feel strongly about their trees, but their roots are ripping up the sidewalks. I mean, it's a challenging issue, but also I mean, it's an area where we're just talking about Councilmember Morales. It's an area where there will be more consensus. I think Councilmember Saka has talked a lot about sidewalk improvement. In fact, he has said basically new sidewalk is the only new thing he wants to fund in the next transportation levy. Everything else he wants to just pretty much be maintenance. So, I think, and then Councilmember Morales, passed a bill that would make it so the Seattle Department of Transportation is more obligated to make sidewalk improvements during, big, arterial projects.
Right.
So there has been more movement on this than I can remember on the council. Certainly since, I think the last big movement was probably the federal government telling the city it had to fix all of its busted curb ramps.
The
But,
other consent decree. Yeah.
The other consent decree. Yeah, exactly. But, there's a lot more conversation, I would say, around this than there has been in a lot of years. So a long way to go. But I would think that there appears to be appetite to push this issue forward a little bit more.
I think so too. And I was interested to see this look into this idea of alternative walkways, because I think a lot of us think sidewalk and so okay, get the concrete out there, let's put that groove down the middle or whatever else. But SDOT was talking about this at the meeting, basically this idea of, okay, what if it's not a traditional sidewalk? What if we make something more like an asphalt walkway for people to get through in certain areas where they really need the help? Might be a little bit more temporary, might be a little less durable, I guess, but at least it would be something, and it could be put in there for a lot less. I just thought that was an interesting side of this, that I've heard rumblings about this before, but to see it in black and white, I mean, some of these costs for putting in something that's a little less expensive is a lot less expensive. I mean, it's almost half the cost of what a traditional sidewalk would look like. This whole idea of alternative walkways, do you think something's going to happen with that? I'm just thinking about a council that's up against a big budget crunch, and they might consider something like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of an acknowledgement of the political and budget realities that the city's not likely to build. I don't remember what the mileage is. I had it in my head once, but it's basically something like, I think it's a quarter of the city. Basically, I think it's 27% of the city.
27%. Yeah, that's what I mentioned.
Sidewalks. And so, just the political reality of that is the city's not going to build those because they cost too much. But if you kind of acknowledge that and say something's better than nothing, then sure, these alternative roadways could make some sense until 10 years from now, and they all need to be replaced again.
Yeah, that's going to be the big challenge on this one. We'll be keeping an eye on that issue as it continues to go through the council here, and as it goes into next year when we start talking a little bit more about the transportation levy. But there's a lot still ahead with that as well. And David, I thank you for jumping on that conversation. And we're going to talk about another one of David's stories coming up here next, talking about a disqualified judge and the public defenders who support her, a continuing saga in the municipal court. That's coming up on What's Next. All right, first off, apologies, folks. I thought I had it all lined up to answer a viewer and listener question here in the best way that I could. There is one more call and email that needs to come through for me. I've put in a few requests, but I'm going to answer this viewer question, this listener question coming up here for people who are listening to the podcast. We try to take care of our podcast listeners here, our patrons especially, and I will make sure that we have an answer for this next week. Promise, promise, promise. All right. That's what I got for you. We do need some more questions in the pipeline, though, folks. Please write to Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Spell it out at gmail.com, and thank you for your input. David, I wanted to get an update on Judge Vedati and the municipal court here. She was disqualified from criminal cases by City Attorney Ann Davison. We spoke to this a couple of weeks ago. Now what's happening?
Yeah, it's quite the little saga. Defense attorneys thought, we're frustrated. We think the disqualifications happening by the prosecutors are illegitimate. So we're going to try and come up with basically a counterpunch. And that was this pitch to basically send a whole bunch of subpoenas to Judge Vedati for her signature, even if they were in cases that wouldn't necessarily ever end up in her court. The idea being that should those cases come up, she's already taken what they believe to be discretionary action, and therefore would not be allowed to be disqualified from the cases. There was some question about whether signing a subpoena is in fact a discretionary action. Regardless, it really angered the presiding judge, Judge Faye Chess. And it appears that this approach kind of backfired. The interesting thing here is, we have a new city attorney that has been a lot more explicit about wanting to crack down on even low-level crime, and it's sort of running into the I don't want to say vestiges, because that makes it sound like it's done, but sort of a more progressive wave of criminal justice that I think Judge Vedati and her election signifies. So here we have kind of two political inclinations of Seattle toward public safety and criminal justice. One in Judge Vedati and Ann Davison kind of clashing, and it's creating for some messy situations that play out in highly technical ways.
Right. In municipal court, we're talking about these misdemeanors here, which are, yeah, you're right. They're clearly a priority for Ann Davison and a lot of voters too. I think that's why she was elected into office. But then again, Judge Vedati was voted in as well. So I guess you have this battle going back and forth. Do you have any idea where this will go? It sounds like this plan by the public defenders didn't really work out. Does Judge Vedati consider any legal action of her own, or do you have any idea what the next chapter is on this one, David?
Yeah, I think the public defense is going to ask a higher, maybe superior court to win. They like I said, they don't feel like the disqualifications are happening properly. They think they're basically too blanket, that the cases should be before Judge Vedati, before they're allowed to disqualify her from those cases. And so they're probably going to, and then, the subpoena question, I think probably what happens is it ends up at a superior court that way. Because, there's disagreement among the judges in the municipal court on this stuff too. I think all of them at this point are starting to acknowledge they would benefit from a higher judge kind of saying, look, this is what the process should look like. Here's what the city attorney's office is allowed to do. Here's what the defense is allowed to do. Here's what you judges are allowed to do.
Yeah.
And then that'll be that.
Wow. I hope so. I always go back to this municipal court and how overloaded it is, and thinking about that and what it means to have this additional layer of bureaucracy and another layer of court cases on top of the court on top of this thing. Is there any end in sight there? Because we talked about the issues they were having with their computer system not too long ago either. It just doesn't seem like a really well-functioning department right now. And I hope I'm not overstating that, but can you give us some insight as to what's going on?
I don't think it's well-functioning. I don't know that it's necessarily the departments to blame so much as the whole system. I mean, you could go from, space in the jail to, parole, what the state of parole. Now you're down basically a judge. You've got backlogs that you're trying to work through. You've got a much more aggressive city attorney who's kind of trying to push more cases through. So I think it's just a system that is groaning under its own weight that I would say has not really fully recovered from the pandemic, which isn't to say it was functioning like perfectly before the pandemic anyway, but it's just kind of, it feels like this particular is a system that just has not bounced back from all of the issues caused by the pandemic.
Wow. That's a good observation there. And I'm waiting for your next piece on that, David, for sure, because I know there's going to be some more to come out of that. And thank you for breaking down all those issues with him. But I do need to wrap up with you. And I guess I need to ask, here we are, just about a week until the start of the Mariners regular season. Talk to me about excitement level versus panic level. Where are you balancing out right now?
I'm excited. I think this is the time to be excited. If you're panicking already, then you're selling yourself short. This is the time for optimism. Even if you're an Oakland A's fan, this is a time when I fully endorse being hopelessly optimistic, because come All-Star break, we'll have plenty of reasons to panic. I'm sure. But I don't know. I feel good about this team. I feel better about this team than I did the last team. So that's an improvement.
Yeah. All right. It's the David barometer that's always important to consult here when we talk about the M. So I appreciate it as always, David, for those insights. I appreciate you being with me here on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks especially to our patrons who support the show. Andy, another shout out to you. Thanks a lot, man. Please get in touch. Send us some questions. Seattle News, Views, and Brews at gmail.com. We answer our patrons' questions on the show when we can. This podcast is on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you like to listen. We are there. Please also find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Show your support if you would be so kind. Thanks for watching on Converge Media, too. We'll see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2024.